Welcome to the Ramchal School, the writings of the Amsterdam period between 1735 and 1743. Today we are giving the sixth lecture, and we're going to speak about grammar, logic, and rhetoric. However, before I start, I want to go back to the end of my previous video where I spoke about Ramchal's signature at the end of Mesilat Yesharim, because I did not complete what I wanted to say there. So I'm going to sum it up now. At the end of Mesilat Yesharim, Ramchal signs his name Moshe ben Arav Yaakov Chai Lutzato Samachtet. And the question is, what does Samachtet stand for? So in some editions, they opened up those abbreviations and they wrote that Samachtet stands for Sfaradi Tahor, which means pure blood Spaniard. But we said that that cannot be. Why? Because Ramchal was an Ashkenazi. How do we know? We know because there's a letter that was written after his time by a member of the family, Shmuel David Lutzato, known as Shadal, who was a very great, one of the greatest Jewish scholars in the first half of the 19th century. In one of his letters, he writes about the origins of the family. And he says that the family came from an area in eastern Germany around the Polish border called Lausitz in German, Luzica in Polish. So when the family came to Italy, probably sometime in the 1500s, they were called by the name of the area they came from. So from Lausitz or Luzica, you ended up with Lutzato or even Luzzati. So that's how we know that the family came from Ashkenaz. So then what's the meaning of Samachtet? So if you open a dictionary of abbreviations, you'll see that Samachtet, the first meaning is Seife Tav, Sofo Tov in Hebrew, which means may his end be well, or may it be good for him in the end. And this is something that Ramchal refers to his father, who apparently was not doing well at the time. He probably had health issues, and he expresses there a wish that his father should be well. Seife Tav. So now we can start and speak about grammar, logic, and rhetoric. But in order to get a better understanding of those topics, I have to explain that in the Middle Ages, the classical program of studies was made of 7 disciplines. Those 7 disciplines were divided in 2 parts. One part dealt with mathematics, and another part dealt with language. The part dealing with mathematics included 4 disciplines: arithmetics, geometry, astronomy, and music. And it was called a quadrivium, the 4 ways. The part dealing with language included 3 disciplines: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And it was called trivium, 3 ways. So we already understand that when Ramchal wrote those books, grammar, 2 books of logic, and rhetoric, it's already in the background of this classical studies, the so-called 7 liberal arts. And why? because, as we said, those old Moranos, when they were new Christians and they were in Spain or in Portugal, they learned Latin, they went to school, and they learned all those disciplines, and they knew them well. And as a matter of fact, they also wrote about these things. And if you ask why did Ramchal write a trivium in 1742, my guess is that it was probably his friend and Talmud, David Franco Mendes, who asked him for an update because Ramchal was already getting ready to leave for the land of Israel. He left in early 1743. So let us say something about the grammar. I'm not going to get into the system that's used by Ramchal in this grammar, but I will just, as usually, I will just speak about something that relates to the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam. Towards the end of that grammar, Ramchal mentions that there's a difference between biblical Hebrew and spoken Hebrew. And he says that when one speaks Hebrew, one has to be careful to vocalize the words properly so there's no misunderstanding. And this raises the question, who was speaking Hebrew at the time? Where in the middle of the 18th century, Jews were not speaking Hebrew. They read Hebrew, but it was not a spoken language. The answer is, again, we have a testimony from Rabbi Shabtai Bass, who visited Amsterdam in the late 1600s, and he wrote in detail what he saw there about how the Portuguese Jews were learning in the Talmud Torah, in the yeshiva. And he was very impressed by their system of learning. And he says that when they came, when the students already reached a level, which was the fourth level in the yeshiva, where they learned Mishnah, then not only they learned in Hebrew, but they also learned how to speak in Hebrew. So they were conversing in Hebrew in learning. We also know that there was another teacher, a well-known teacher just before Ramchal's time in Amsterdam, who was called Moshe Raphael d'Aguilar, who made a point of speaking Hebrew with his students even when he was walking in the street with them. So now we understand that when Ramchal speaks about, makes that distinction between biblical Hebrew and spoken Hebrew, it's not just an abstract or theoretical distinction, but it's relating to a reality, because if not all, at least some of the Jews Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam did speak Hebrew and made a point of speaking Hebrew. Now I'm going to say something about the general logic, Sefer HaHigayon. If one looks at the Sefer HaHigayon, we already spoke about it a little bit in the introduction, we see that in the beginning of the book, Ramchal writes that Sefer HaHigayon was mainly a translation from foreign books, and we know from the studies that were made that he's referring to a Latin book. It was a textbook for students in Latin. It was printed in German in 1650, and Ramchal took that book as a base for his general logic, Sefer HaHigayon. But he translated it in Hebrew and adapted it for his own needs. But if we look in the manuscript, we see that for every technical, logical term in the text, there's a footnote in a reference to the Latin term which correspond to the Hebrew. Why did Ramchal do that? Because, again, probably all these old Marranos, newcomers that came to Amsterdam, and they were learning Hebrew and they knew Hebrew, but probably they were not familiar yet with the technical terminology of logic in Hebrew, so that for that reason he left in the footnotes the Latin term so that people could really have a better understanding because they were familiar with the Latin. I said to look in the manuscript because in the printed editions you won't see the footnotes there, but they put all the Latin terminology at the end of the book as if it was a glossary, but it's not. As I said, those are notes that were in the text, footnotes that were in the text to help the Marrano, old Marrano readers. So now we're ready for the rhetoric. Here too I have to go back in the past. The book that Ramchal wrote here in Amsterdam was called Sefer HaMelitza, which could translate roughly about book of rhetoric. But if we look in the past, we already mentioned that when he was still in Italy, Ramchal wrote a general rhetoric that was called Leshon Limudim, the tongue of the learned, which was printed in 1727 when he was 20 years old. And that logic, that rhetoric, as I said, is very general because it includes not only all the things that one should know in order to speak properly and deliver a speech and influence people, and which devices to use, but it also has chapters about the aesthetics of biblical Hebrew, or how to write verses in poetry, and there's even a chapter about how to expand on verses and write write a play out of them. All this is missing in Sefer HaMelitza, written in Amsterdam, and it's all reduced to the art of speech, to the art of speech, and this is why the proper translation for Sefer HaMelitza should really be the book or the treatise on eloquence. It is true also that the Portuguese were very fond of speeches. They love discourses. As a matter of fact, when Chida, we already mentioned him, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, who traveled through Europe and wrote a very interesting and important travel diary. When he was in Amsterdam, he mentions the art of speech of the Portuguese rabbis, and he calls it Rhetorica Portuguesit, that which shows that really they were really proud of it and they were really involved. One more thing I want to say is that when the Great Synagogue was inaugurated in 1675, of course there was a big there were big festivities and there were a lot of speeches. As a matter of fact, 7 rabbis spoke, but what they did is that instead of having all the 7 rabbis speak on the day of the inauguration itself, they had the inauguration day, and then for 7 consecutive days, each one of those 7 rabbis gave a speech, so they can enjoy each speech and discourse on its own. Now I want to say something about the logic of the Talmud, Derech Tvunot. I'm speaking about the logic of the Talmud separately because I have a little, I'm a little prejudiced concerning that book. I think it's one of the greatest piece of works of Ramchal, in the sense that not only it's his own creation, because we see if we want to differentiate it with the general logic, which was a translation and adaptation, the book of the logic of the Talmud, Derech Tvunot, was really Ramchal's own creation, and it's unprecedented. There were many introductions to the Talmud which were written through the ages, but none of them spoke about the thinking of the Talmud, the relationship between the subject and the predicates, and how many types of such relationships there were in the Talmud, and things of that kind. It is indeed an amazing piece of work. And what I want to say about this book and the relationship to the Portuguese community has to do with the glossary that's found at the end of the book. At the end of the Derech Tvunot, in the original edition from 1742 in Amsterdam, there's a list of 45 technical terms from the book. It's not exhaustive, but it's only like I would say like a sample of the Hebrew terminology that could be found in that book. And facing every Hebrew term, you have a transliteration of every one of these terms in Spanish. I'll give an example. The word geder. Geder in Hebrew means definition. So facing the word geder, you have in Hebrew letters definición in Spanish. Definición with a samer. In Hebrew, in English rather, we say definition with a T, and in Spanish you say definición with a C. However, in the 1950 edition of Derech Tvunot that was published here in Israel by the Mossad Rav Kook, whoever was the editor felt that they wanted to do something maybe nicer, so they wrote out all the transliteration of the Hebrew terms into Latin letters. But they made a mistake. Instead of writing it in Spanish, they wrote it in Italian. So instead of writing definición with a C, they wrote definición with a Z. And that's a mistake, because we see that the Hebrew transliteration has a samer, so it stands for a C, not for a Z. Unfortunately, this mistake still extant today, and if one looks at the bilingual edition of Derech Tvunot English-Hebrew, or rather Hebrew-English, you'll see that at the end of the book, there's still that same mistake repeated there. You have the Hebrew terminology, and facing to it you have the Italian terminology. I mention this because I think, first of all, I want to correct the mistake, and it's important because we want to show that the transliteration was really Spanish, because the Portuguese Jews spoke Portuguese between themselves, but Spanish was their cultural language. As a matter of fact, even when they learned a verse in Hebrew, they translated it right away in Spanish, because that was their cultural language. But I also want to mention that it's we see here that a lack of historical understanding can produce mistakes, even if you'll say this is trivial, it doesn't mean too much. It still can create problems. And I have to mention that if one would think, even for a second, to the fact and think that Ramchal was in Amsterdam, integrated into the Portuguese community, why should he write anything in Italian? There were no Italians there, except for him, maybe and one of his brothers who married there and lived there for a while. There was no point to write anything in Italian. So when the editors of the Mosad Rav Kook and the Feldheim edition later on put that Italian transliteration, it was really a bad mistake, and I felt it was important to mention it. So this puts an end to our lecture for today, and I'm inviting you to follow us on YouTube for our next video. Thank you so much.